Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. North Korea fired more missiles and threatened a full-range intercontinental ballistic missile test. The U.S. deploys stealth jets and nuclear-capable bombers to South Korea as a show of force. On the program today, we have General David Stilwell joining us via Skype and Dr. Patrick Cronin in the studio with me to discuss the military threat posed by North Korea.
Whether it is an ICBM test, as you described, or a nuclear test, this would be significant, severe, grave escalation that the United States would take especially seriously.
We do applaud Japan's national security strategy and its commitment to modernization, which just strengthens the alliance and the cooperation between our two countries.
Joining us via Skype is General David Stilwell, former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Brigadier General Stilwell served in the Air Force for 35 years and was the Asia advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In the studio with me, Dr. Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Cronin previously served as Senior Director of the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, General Stilwell, Kim Yo-jong threatened to launch an intercontinental ballistic missile on a normal trajectory, similar to what would be used in a military attack, rather than on a lofted trajectory. If North Korea fires a missile into the Pacific Ocean, flying over Japan, how serious would this be?
Well, if it was on a real, a normal trajectory, as she says, it would be extremely serious because, we've been 30 years ignoring and forgetting about the lessons of the Cold War. But there's a couple issues between conventional and nuclear forces. Nuclear forces travel very quickly and in long ranges, typically. And you have very little time in the beginning of a launch to determine what the intent of that missile is. Mm-hmm. Is it a satellite launch? Is it a short-range test? Or is it a long-range test? And so the North Koreans have been called irrational. I think they're the most rational government on the planet, and they do know better than to launch something that has all the makings of an attack, because there would be a response. And so that sort of miscalculation would not be in Kim Yo-jong or Pyongyang's favor. They would have to, and again, there were a lot of coordination and conversation mechanisms, hotlines between the U.S. and Soviet Union that would prevent such a thing from turning into the worst possible case.
General Stilwell, the reason why North Korea wants to do this is to prove that it has the re-entry capability. While you were in the government, was it U.S. government determination that North Korea indeed had that capability of re-entry?
I don't think anything's sure yet, but they're doing a good job of presenting themselves as having the capability. And again, this takes back to nuclear doctrine from the 80s, when I started this, is, deterrence and all these things are more messages and they're more information than they are actual capability. It only takes one missile to get to the U.S., land somewhere in the U.S. mainland or even in waters near the U.S. To bring about the end of the regime. And so we have to assume the worst, but again, there hasn't been enough testing. This is a very complicated capability. And I don't think there's been enough capability or testing to prove that they have that capability. But who wants to take that chance?
Dr. Cronin, now North Korea's Rodong Sinmun recently reiterated the country's nuclear doctrine of using nuclear forces preemptively. Now, is there a higher chance of miscalculation and a nuclear clash on the Korean peninsula because North Korea is pursuing preemptive strikes in diverse scenarios?
Well, I think that doctrine is deliberately provocative, but I don't think North Korea intends to be irrational, as Dave Stilwell just told us. That doesn't mean it's not dangerous and without risk. it is risky. I think what North Korea wants is to first make sure that there's no decapitation strike on the Kim regime, so he wants survival, but then he also wants to be able to parlay his growing arsenal of weapons for leverage, political leverage. So if he can borrow from the Russian playbook and threaten the possibility of a nuclear preemptive attack, he's hoping he can win concessions that way, either political concessions or military concessions for what he wants to achieve.
Now, General Stilwell, Dr. Cronin just talked about decapitation strategy that North Korea wants to avoid. U.S. deployed nuclear-capable B-52 bombers and F-22 stealth fighter jets to the region. Why should North Korea fear F-22 fighter jets? You were in the Air Force for 35 years.
Yeah, I fear the F-22. When I was flying F-16s, those things were invisible, as the name implies. They are stealth fighters. Well, the reason is because if the things are operating in the region and on the peninsula, the warning time is very limited. And so if they were to respond or try to defend against it, they wouldn't have much time of people on the ground observing them taking off and all those things. And then once airborne, they truly are invisible to the radar, so they wouldn't be able to target them with surface-to-air missiles and the like. So it's a great capability, and it should be a strong message to Pyongyang that this is something they don't want to mess with.
So it is invisible, and I read from Stars and Stripes of pilots flying inside the airspace of North Korea. Does U.S. jets fly into North Korea and then come out? And I also hear from military officers say that North Korea wouldn't know, even if U.S. fighter jets launches precision strike inside North Korea and then return. Just technical sense, in general sense, what can you talk about this scenario?
Well, probably not a lot as far as what we do for training and the like. We obviously operate very close to North Korea, and there's two parts to that. There's a training aspect, is to understanding the area, how close and tight it is. It's a very small area, but also messaging the North Koreans and showing them that we are, committed and capable, again, to deter any miscalculations. But as far as what we actually do and where we fly, that's probably better reserved for a different platform.
Do you think North Korea's Kim Jong-un should fear that such a scenario is possible on him about stealth jets going into North Korean airspace? And technically, is that possible?
Should he be concerned? Of course,
Yes.
he should. We need to demonstrate and continue to continuously demonstrate allied capabilities. That's U.S., Korea, but also Japan. There's also U.S.-only capabilities that we can demonstrate from Guam, B-52 deployments, and the rest. And so, in fact, it's important, it's essential that we do that, lest there be some sort of miscalculation by the Kim regime. Now, I think they've played that hand pretty well. 2010, we saw the sinking of a South Korean cruiser and then a shelling of a South Korean occupied island. Nothing happened. So their calculus was pretty good. I'm pretty sure after the 2017, 2021 maximum pressure, I think we did demonstrate to the North Koreans, though, that there are limits and that there would be a response should they miscalculate.
Now, Dr. Cronin, the White House says North Korea has sold and delivered infantry rockets and missiles to Russia's Wagner mercenary group. What is the significance of this? Why is the U.S. government so open about revealing all these intelligence? And is this a proliferation threat?
Well, it's significant well beyond North Korea in the first place, just because Russia's invasion of Ukraine in the year 2022 is the story of the year. It has basically said the world order is up for grabs to some extent. There's no penalty for using force, invading a neighbor. North Korea wants to maybe borrow from that. And so we're very concerned about deterrence in East Asia, on the peninsula, regarding Taiwan, regarding the South and East China Seas. The fact that North Korea denied that it was providing arms to Russia, which desperately needs more ammunition, more troops, and yet now we have confirmation apparently from the U.S. intelligence community, suggests that North Korea definitely wanted to work with its Russian ally and friend, but it didn't want to publicize that. Now we have proof that they're doing that. And Wagner Group is a group of convicts. It's a group of intelligence operatives leading convicts against peaceful Ukraine in a brutal war.
Do you anticipate North Korea more support to the Wagner Group in the future?
So they've confirmed one major shipment but they expect more shipments, and I do expect that pipeline to remain open because Russia desperately needs these weapons. North Korea is probably benefiting either money or intelligence or both.
Now, General Stilwell, a media report today said that in Mar-a-Lago there were classified documents on Iranian missile technology and the Chinese capabilities, and also a detail of one country's nuclear program. Now, this must be talking about North Korea's nuclear program. What can you tell us about the state of North Korean nuclear capability?
Well, it's progressed fairly steadily, as Dr. Cronin mentioned, 6 tests. I was in Beijing when they did the 3rd test in March of 2013. And I have to tell you that that made the Chinese as angry or angrier than anyone else. And so they've developed these things steadily. They've been violating the non-proliferation treaty. They've done, test ban, all those things. And they've done it with relative impunity. Obviously, the U.S. allies, the UN can do something, but it's really incumbent on China to stand up and stop this capability from becoming fully capable.
General Stilwell, during the Hanoi summit, the U.S. government came up with the information on the Kangsong clandestine nuclear facility. What do you know about Kangsong?
Luckily, nothing. That makes jobs like this easier. I don't have to worry about saying too much. But we do know that there are, it's an expansive process. They didn't just stick with one area. They are, actively looking to develop a full capability in the name of defense. For such a small country with such a small GDP, it's amazing how much they have accomplished. Unfortunately, they've done it on the backs of their people who are starving and have no real hope of being able to achieve anything like their neighbors and brothers and sisters in the South. So although it's the development of these capabilities, it has been impressive for the size of the country, it's completely misguided, and hopefully will stop soon.
So General Stilwell, you just told me that you personally don't know about any of those information, but U.S. government as a whole, of course, would have detailed information on North Korea's clandestine facilities, right?
I'm sure we know a lot more than anybody's going to talk about in a program like this.
Now, Dr. Cronin, U.S.-RK Japan trilateral military cooperation is accelerating. What will the enhanced cooperation end up with missile defense system integration? Is this something the U.S. government wants?
I think the U.S. does want further integration of air and missile defenses because if you look at the theater from a North Korean perspective, their missiles can hit South Korea, Japan, Guam, and possibly even the United States. So the fact that North Korea sees this as one theater, it's very important for the United States and its allies to better integrate so they can respond more cohesively. I don't think it's going to go in integration right away. I think this is still closer and closer coordination, and it's being driven by the threat. And finally, just Eun-jung, I think if you look at Ukraine and what we heard from President Zelensky, there's no doubt that he needs to integrate his air and missile defenses in Ukraine. That's one theater because all the war is happening inside Ukraine. That exactly, though, translates to Northeast Asia, where it is one theater and we need integration.
Now, General Stilwell, there are strong calls urging China's constructive role in restraining North Korea. Should the U.S. rely on China to play a role?
First question is, should we rely on the PRC? No, but we should pressure them to do their job. Security Council resolution that stopped illegal ship transfers of energy to ensure that the pressure on the North Korean government, to come to the table in earnest, and also to prevent its military from or reduce its capability. Those things have been happening with the PRC looking the other way. And so China has to be a major part of this. They do, when they're angry, like in March 2013, they will put pressure on the PRC when they have to.
Now, I want to turn to Japan's most rapid expansion of military power since the creation of its self-defense forces. Dr. Cronin, how does Japan's increased military power support U.S. strategy to promote open and free Indo-Pacific and to keep the rules-based order there?
Well, in one sense, these documents that are coming out of Japan this month seem transformational, and they are, but they're signaling a future transition for a Japan that has not just defense, but has some at least minimal offensive capability because deterrence requires that. That's the most cost-effective way for, frankly, South Korea, Japan, the United States to keep deterrence and make sure there's no miscalculation. But we're still dealing with a fraction of the size of the Chinese, the PLA's modernization. So you might look at this as Japan is just trying not to lose further ground vis-a-vis China's growing military capabilities, and it's not trying to lose ground vis-a-vis North Korea's missile capabilities. So it's very much part of a U.S. and allied deterrence and defense strategy, and it's going to help build a so-called Southwest wall in the Southwest Island chain for Japan, first and foremost, but also to build capabilities against, say, North Korea's missiles, which could be used in a preemptive attack if North Korea crossed that threshold.
Now, General Stilwell, Japan has great economic powers, has great technological powers, can quickly build up its military. And how far does the U.S. want Japan to grow its military power? Is there any limit?
Well, what the U.S. wants is really not that relevant. Obviously, we want strong security partners, but this is a decision by the Japanese people. And, the government can't make decisions like this without paying attention to what the Japanese people are ready to tolerate. And, the post-World War II mood in Japan was very much pacifist. They didn't want to be taken down that path again. But it's been a long time since the end of that war, and the threats in the region are growing, very quickly. And those threats primarily come from the PRC, as we've noted. And so it's entirely reasonable, rational, and actually overdue that they modernize. Go ahead.
General, this is not possible unless there's full support from the U.S. government that Japan can build up its military powers.
Well, North Korea has built up its military powers without support from the U.S. Of course, they can do it without us. We would prefer that we do it in coordination with them. And, I worked very closely with Japanese self-defense
forces. But the U.S. is the one who drafted the pacifist constitution after the World War II and has close relations in Japanese, whether Japan builds up its military or not.
Again, agreed on all those, but the Constitution was the start. The Japanese people then have modified that Constitution as time gone forward. Prime Minister Abe did a very aggressive and forward-leaning, seeing the threat and getting the Japanese people used to the thought that the concept of only self-defense is perhaps out of date, which it is. And so the U.S., I'm sure that everybody in my Pentagon friends from the past are also very positive about this development, and the region shouldn't be concerned. This happened a long time ago. We need to get past history and start looking forward as a group of allies in the region.
Dr. Cronin, on that note, what General Stilwell just noted about the Asian neighbors, they are wary of Japan's military buildup and removing pacifist constraints. Is this a legitimate concern, and do we need to allay those concerns? Is there any role that U.S. can play in doing that?
Well, I think Japan is very sensitive to those concerns, and they have a very effective and active diplomacy with the region that provides development assistance, that deals with cooperation with neighbors, because they know there's that history. They know there's bad blood. At the same time, let's put this in perspective. Japan, if they enact everything they're talking about right now, they'll go from about $50 billion of defense spending a year, maybe to $85 billion. That's 1/10 of the U.S. defense budget this year. It's a fraction of China's budget. That's the outer limits, and I don't even know if they're going to achieve that in 5 years. So when they add some counter-strike capabilities, just because people deliberately want to misportray it as a preemptive strike capability, because theoretically it could be used preemptively, Japan has layers of legal and bureaucratic and political barriers to doing that. And the region knows that. They've worked with Japan. They know that this is a self-defense force still, first and foremost.
Now you talk about counter-strike capability. Japan says when using counter-strike capability, coming against missile coming from North Korea, it does not need prior approval from South Korea. Hearing that, South Korea said, no, of course Japan needs to consult with South Korea before doing that launch. What is your take on this issue?
Well, there are two separate issues here. Operationally, it may not be possible, but politically and strategically, it's essential. So that's why right now, in peacetime, before there is any missile launch, we need closer trilateral cooperation on contingency planning among Tokyo, Seoul, and Washington, and that needs to happen now.
How is it operationally not possible?
Well, just as General Still was saying, because of the timelines. We're dealing with minutes. So especially when you move toward defensive systems based on artificial intelligence, they're picking up early warnings and indications. If they see a target light up and a missile coming at them, if they're going to go after that missile site, they may be communicating that to Tokyo in the United States, but by the time it's received and understood in Tokyo and sent up the chain, it's already too late. You've taken out the missile site.
In responding to a missile attack from North Korea to Japan and Japan launching the counter-strike capability, is there any way they can utilize GSOMIA to consult with South Korea operationally?
I think it's possible. As far as I remember, I spent a lot of time in 2019 trying to preserve GSOMIA, if you recall, it's simple information sharing. There's no real the information isn't that sensitive. But South Korea has very good initial launch information that it needs to share, not just with Japan, but remember, there's 50,000 American troops and families stationed in Japan who are also at risk. So however South Korea wants to define this, it's not just Japan, it's the U.S. that's at risk. And so GSOMIA is an excellent coordination mechanism. The information that goes over it is sensitive in some cases, it's not sensitive in others. But as I keep saying, it's the message of friction and failure to cooperate that encourages North Korea to do these things. South Korea should be very interested in that.
General Stilwell, you just talked about how South Korea has good initial information. Some people in South Korea say South Korea has all the good intelligence, and if they share with Japan, it's not fair. What is your take?
There's no, the logic fails in that. You know, I don't know why sharing that information would harm the South Koreans. And meantime, there is plenty of capability on Japan, radar sites and stuff that also contribute to these final solutions for targeting missiles while in flight. And so also remember that even though the missiles may not be targeting South Korea per se, they are targeting the UN rear bases that would support South Korea in the event of a conflict. And if that missile did end up hitting Japan, there would be conflict and it would impact South Korea. And if those bases are not available to move people, supplies, capabilities onto the peninsula, which Japan has the right to veto, then that is not in South Korea's interest.
Did you want to add?
Well, only that this is exactly why President Yoon has heroically decided to share early warning data, because he knows that Korea does have good data, but it's useless unless we try to further coordinate with Japan and U.S. forces in the region, because that's where North Korea will look for the weaknesses in these alliance networks.
Dr. Cronin, North Korea criticizes Japan's military buildup, but didn't North Korea's series of provocation actually open the doors for Japan's military buildup, do you think?
North Korea has been targeting Japan, has been threatening Japan, has fired missiles repeatedly over Japan. Yes, it is absolutely one of the major reasons why Japan has built up both its missile defenses, spending $20 billion over the last 20 years, but also now is starting to introduce some counter-strike capability, because this new provocative doctrine out of North Korea, a preemptive strike, is exactly something that Japan has to fear. And Japan does not want to be decoupled from the United States nuclear umbrella, so it wants to make sure it has some deterrent means of its own.
Now, before we go, General Stilwell, the previous Moon Jae-in government in South Korea pursuing strategic ambiguity between Washington and Beijing, did that somehow influence Washington to give more fuller support for Japan's military buildup, to have Japan support U.S. strategy in Indo-Pacific more?
Coordinating with allies is complicated. It can be frustrating, but generally speaking, we're stronger as allies than we are operating independently. And so the ambiguity is a political term in this case, but I don't think there was any unambiguity. There's anything unclear about the South Korean and President Moon's decision to bring THAAD to the peninsula, an upgraded air defense capability that, again, not only protects American forces, but ROK people and forces as well. So we've got the political speech, and we have to do that to make sure that their domestic populations are on board. But to me, the strongest message from the Moon period was the THAAD decision, and that was, again, very supportive of the alliance and trilateral cooperation.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. General Stilwell, Dr. Cronin, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.